All right, it's Peter Cole, and I'm back with part 5 of my intro to orchestral sample libraries. This is a series I'm doing for beginners. So if you're new to orchestral sample libraries and trying to figure out how to use them within your computer, within your digital audio workstation, trying to make orchestral string libraries sound more realistic, that's what this series is all about. In today's episode, we're going to be focused on two MIDI parameters, modulation and expression. These are two really important things to understand, and it's a great segue from what we did in the previous episode, which I'll link to in the description of this video. And in that previous episode, we started to scratch the surface of this concept of using what's inside of our DAW, what are these MIDI parameters we can use to play with. And in particular, the one we talked about in that lesson was velocity. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to give a quick little recap of velocity because it's a good entry point into modulation in particular. So just a quick recap, and again, I urge you to watch the previous lesson first because it'll go into a lot more detail. But the concept of velocity and how it relates to the sound within our orchestra and our sampled orchestra, of course, a velocity is how hard you hit the instrument. And I think one of the most simplest ways to appreciate that is with percussion, because we all know if you hit a drum soft, it's going to have a different sound than if you hit a drum loud, right? So when you hit a drum soft, it's not only a softer volume, but there's a different timbre or timbre. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but it's the texture and overall way that the sound sounds, regardless of how loud it is, right? You can imagine this. You hit something soft and you hit something loud. It's not just the volume that's different. It's the timbre. It's the texture of that instrument. Way different. It's the same with a string instrument. You play a violin very soft, it's going to sound way different than if you strike it really hard. And again, it's not just volume. It's the overall texture of the sound. So that's what's key about velocity. The thing with velocity, though, is you're applying the velocity at a note by note level. So that's pretty powerful in one degree because you can literally assign a different velocity for every note of your piece. So if you have, for example, a bunch of short violin runs doing an ostinato, each one of those notes can have a slightly different velocity, which makes it sound more real because no player in the world is going to be able to hit their instrument with the exact same velocity every single time. So we use that just right there to make an instrument sound more real. However, when that's at a note by note level, so it's great for percussion because you're just hitting things once, right? It's just one sound, one quick burst. Same with a short note on a violin, like a staccato or a spiccato. One single note at a time. So you can control the velocity of each of those. Super powerful. However, the way a string player plays for a longer note, what if you had a sustained note, which we're very used to in orchestral work, right? A long sustained string section playing a single note. Throughout the sustain of that note, velocity is only set at once when you first hit it. So it's literally just the same velocity the whole time for that sustained note. So that's a little unrealistic because a string player and a string section for that matter would be varying their velocity. For example, if it's a slow kind of emotional piece, they might start soft and then swell up and then come back down and fade out, right? You can imagine that sound. We'll hear an example in a second. So in that scenario, how do we do that? How do we control, if velocity is only able to control that first note as it's programmed in your DAW, how do we create that swelling and that dynamic up and down? That's what modulation is for. So kind of think of them as modulation as the ability to adjust the timbre of each as a note plays over a period of time. So a single note, you're able to create those swells and those fades. It's a beautiful thing. Modulation is super, super powerful. Real quick, before we do the example here, I'll say hopefully that helps you understand modulation. The other parameter we're going to talk about, they're very related and sometimes confused. I was confused when I first learned this, and that is expression, which to me is a name that makes it a little more confusing too, because I think of expression as controlling those dynamics and making it more expressive, which it's doing. However, expression is really a little bit more simple than that. It's literally just the volume. So remember, we made a big distinction at the beginning of this video between how something sounds from a timbre and texture as opposed to just its volume. And they're very related, and it can be confusing. So I understand if this is a little weird at first. Expression has no impact on the timbre. Expression has no impact. It doesn't matter if you hit it soft or loud. Expression is purely the volume. So some people might wonder, well, why do I need expression when I already have a volume knob? And so I'm going to explain that. There is a reason. But I just want to give a quick intro so you had an idea of the two things we're going to be discussing. Okay, so now I'm inside my DAW, Logic, and of course you might be in a different DAW, and so it might look a little different, but the concepts are exactly the same, I promise you. You will definitely have the ability to edit modulation and expression, and if you don't, for some reason, you need to get a DAW that does. So all the popular ones, Logic, Cubase, Pro Tools, I'm sure Ableton Live does as well. I'm not as familiar with that one. But you need the ability to control these MIDI parameters. They're super important. So I have a very simple transition open between two notes, as you can see, and they're long. See the length of these? They're long sustained notes. So as I said a minute ago, the main purpose of modulation, at least of what we're talking about today anyway, is to control the dynamics throughout a sustained note. So this ability to kind of create a swell as you go up and then fade back down. Something you can't do with velocity, because I'll switch over to velocity here so you can see it. I'm switching to velocity. Look at that. One velocity for each note. So for a percussive instrument, again, kind of a little repeat of what I just said a minute ago. For percussion and more short notes, that makes a lot of sense because the note's not sustaining any longer. But if you want the sustained note itself to have dynamics within the movement of it, that's where modulation and expression come in. So that's what these funky looking lines here look like. And it looks a little weird, but that's because each little dot, little orange dot represents, you can kind of think of it as a different velocity, right? Which is crazy, but that's what's going on. It's serving up a slightly different sample that's appropriate for the velocity at that moment in time. And you can see here kind of the shape that I've created, and we'll do another example in a minute, but you'll see the shape. It kind of has it going up and then down and then up and then down. So let's first just listen to this. So hopefully you can hear it. It can be subtle, but actually we want it to be subtle in a lot of ways, right? We don't want it to be too crazy. You can hear it kind of start at a certain velocity, and then it kind of goes up, comes down, and then when it enters the next note, it's kind of going up into the next note. And that's again, the time when understanding how string players perform and how they play their instruments is super helpful. Because imagine, just for the sake of argument, let's kind of imagine how a string player would play these two notes. They might start the note a little soft, and then as they're kind of getting into the bowing of it and creating a little more energy, it goes up. And then as the note starts to taper off, it's kind of fading back down, just like we're doing in this example. And then we start the next note. We go back up and then back down and fade back down. So this is a really common way of using modulation, particularly between two notes, and perhaps more importantly, between two long sustained notes. So these notes, I'll play it again. Listen, they're lasting a good period of time. These are not short sustains. And I say that because that's another really important thing to think about when you're programming modulation. If you have notes that are rather long and the tempo isn't particularly fast, right, it's going to slowly move from one note to the next. And this sort of swelling up and then down and then up, it can sound very natural and create more realism. However, imagine if these notes were much shorter. They might still be sustained, but maybe they're just not lasting as long, and maybe the tempo is faster, so they're going faster. Be careful, because if you create this effect, it's going to kind of have like a up and down effect. So that's something to watch out for. This is a great starting point for modulation, because you're kind of recreating that slow motion of up and down. It's really, really nice and flowing. But if you're at a faster tempo or the notes are shorter, it could actually have the reverse effect. It could kind of sound like you're turning the volume up and down. To that point, you'll notice that modulation isn't controlling the volume. It again, listen very carefully, it's just controlling the sound, the timbre of the note. So now, of course, you probably noticed at the very end here, of course, the modulation is going so low that by this time the note is being played so soft that it does have the effect of the volume becoming lower. It has to, because you're just playing it so soft. But it is not volume, so I just want to keep reminding you, modulation is not volume. The impact of it can make something sound quieter, but again, it's not the volume. And that's what expression is for, and we'll talk about that next. But before we talk about expression, I just want to give an example of a longer passage. So let's look down at this one. Here we have several notes, and the shape of the modulation is a bit different. And part of it is because what I just said a second ago. First of all, the notes are not as long, right? So these two notes, much longer, so we're able to kind of create this up and down movement. Here the notes are closer together, not dramatically so, but closer together. And the other really important thing to point out, which might look a little funky here, is we have a rather significant interval between what is this, an A up to that G. So that's a pretty big jump, and I want you to imagine a string player. They're playing their instrument. When they got to get up to those higher notes, those larger intervals, it's just natural for them to like hit the instrument a little louder, right? A little harder, and also a little bit quicker in terms of how they jump into it. So that's why you'll often see in modulation the jump ups. Does that make sense? The jump ups, the interval ups, that when you're going up in notes, that's also where the modulation goes up. So you can see here early on, I'm kind of starting off and I'm letting the first note build, and it kind of builds up into that slightly higher one. It's not that much of a leap, but it's still higher than this one. Goes up, but not tremendously so, then starts to fade back down, and then this note below it is even lower. So now we're still kind of low, but oh boy, I see this big jump coming up, so I'm starting to hit it a little harder to hit that note, and boom, now we're going up and then back down to fade out. Okay, so I'll stop babbling and let's actually listen to it. So with regards to what I just said, pay attention to particularly where it goes up right here, and listen to the sound, listen to the timbre, how it changes. So hopefully that was pretty noticeable. It might be a little more exaggerated for purposes of the lesson, of course, but hopefully you could hear that we're not just going up in volume here, but the actual sound changes, the timbre changes. It's got more force behind it. If you play guitar or another instrument, you might be able to appreciate this as well, right? When you got to make those big leaps, just human nature, we're like, whoa, we're just going to put more energy behind it. So that's what modulation is trying to recreate. It's trying to recreate that performance. You're recreating a performance. So I start a little soft, go up, but not terribly so, down, back up, and then fade out. So this is how it might look for a longer passage. What's mostly different between the two-note one is that we're creating a more holistic performance. It's not the performance between two different notes so much, it's the performance of the entire phrase. So that's just another way of thinking about it, thinking about the whole phrase, not just the individual transitions. So that's modulation. Before I go on, I'll just call out that you might be wondering how I entered this weird data here. And that's obviously very important. You have to know how to do that. The way I often do it is I'll play the performance just naturally as I'm on my keyboard writing my music, and I won't really worry about modulation or anything, any parameters for that matter, while I'm composing. That's just me. Then I'll go back and I will choose modulation, and in Logic you hold down your command key and you can draw. So I'm literally just drawing with my mouse. I know a lot of people who absolutely hate this. They hate using their mouse. And so what they will do is they will have a separate hardware device, and you can actually often you can use the what comes with your MIDI keyboard. So there's a lot of keyboards that have these faders and dials and knobs and all this fun stuff. You can attach those knobs and faders to the parameters in your DAW, and then you use the physical fader on your hardware to control the modulation. A lot of professional composers that I know, that's all they do. That's what they use, because it's more tactile, and you're able to actually play with one hand, you're playing the keyboard, and with the other hand, you're adjusting the fader with your other hand. I'm not quite that good yet. I do it sometimes. I use the modulation wheel on my keyboard. Very likely the keyboard you have has what's called a mod wheel. In fact, you've probably seen it and maybe even used it. That's what that is. The mod wheel is automatically assigned to control the modulation in your DAW. So instead of using your mouse, you can use the mod wheel on your keyboard. Like I said, it's a great way of, it's almost like it's hard enough that you're using a keyboard to play a cello, right? Because a keyboard is nothing like a cello. So you kind of need those extra parameters and that extra ability to adjust those faders to create more emotion and create more of a performance. So I'm going to start doing more of that. But for now, just to get started, you can just use your mouse inside your DAW. All right, so now let's talk about expression. So in some ways, this is going to be a lot easier and a lot quicker, because really expression is just volume. And my first question when I understood that was like, well, why don't I just use the volume knob? Like, there's already a volume parameter. The big difference is that main master volume is the master volume for that entire channel. So for this phrase of music, there's just that master volume, and you're setting it, and the volumes within the performance need to be adjusted by expression. So think of expression as volume within the volume. So you have your master that controls the overall sound, and then the expression is the volume within there. And that's super important, because you might spend hours getting the volume performance of your phrase done, and then realize, oh no, my cello is just not loud enough overall. So rather than go in and readjust all those parameters of every single fine tuning you just did with the with your volume performance, you just raise the master volume up. That controls overall. Next question you might be wondering is, well, I still don't understand if I have modulation, and that's kind of impacting volume. Not quite the same, but still, why would I need to adjust volume so much within a performance? And that's an excellent question. So let's do an example. The way I usually work is I start defining the modulation. I go in and select expression. See, there it is. And it's really helpful, at least in Logic, that you can actually see, if you look really close, you can see the modulation that I already drew kind of faded behind it. And that's really important, because I find often expression will follow almost very, 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 very closely to what modulation is doing. So even without spending a lot of time thinking about this, I would probably come in and I would make it less dramatic than the modulation, but it would probably sort of follow it, because think about it. What you're trying to do is, as the timbre of the instrument's being affected by the modulation, so is the volume. So you're just kind of squeezing out a little more dynamics, making it a little more noticeable. And on the fade here, you could get a true fade out, and you could literally just have the volume go down like this. And we'll listen to this. This is probably not what I would do, because an instrument doesn't literally just turn its volume down. However, sometimes this might be the effect you're after. So let's just listen to this back. Now, really important, you hear at the very end, it literally faded out because again, we're playing with volume. We are turning this movement right here is turning the volume down. To me, that's usually too dramatic. Sometimes I have to do that within the context of an entire composition and production in particular. Like if it's a bunch of instruments competing for the same frequencies and there's too much going on, sometimes you got to use expression just to turn the thing down. But in this case, we want to create something more natural and it sounds like a performance. So I don't think I would have that fade, unlike the modulation, which faded down, because again, you're playing with modulation, you're playing with the timbre, not the volume. So I would probably do something like that. Very subtle. Let's hear how that sounds. Sounds much better to me because it's more of a natural fade because we're letting the natural decay of playing the instrument softer. That's how it would really work, right? Cello players don't walk around with a volume knob, right? They're making things quieter by how hard they're hitting it. That's modulation and velocity. Expression is purely volume. So be careful with expression. Very, very helpful in adding more dimension and more dynamics for sure. But just remember what you're going after. You're trying to recreate the sound of an instrument, and an instrument doesn't walk around with a volume dial. All right, so that was expression. The other thing I want to just touch on super briefly, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail, but you're probably going to hear the term CC and a number next to it. CC1, CC11, CC7. What is that? Well, CC stands for continuous controller, and really what it is it is a unique value assigned to each of these parameters that your hardware devices and other things that interact with your computer use to identify which parameter they're impacting. So a moment ago, I talked about how a lot of composers use external hardware. So they use their faders on their keyboard, or they buy an external device that has faders on it. They then map those faders to a continuous controller number, a CC number in their DAW, and that's what they use to create the relationship between those parameters we see in our DAW and the device they're using to edit it. Best example, again, is modulation, which you probably have if you have a MIDI keyboard. You probably, like I said, you probably have a mod wheel already there. That mod wheel is assigned CC number 1. It's the first one. And that CC number is what the DAW uses to understand what you're trying to control. Expression, same thing. Expression has CC11. I don't know where all these numbers, where they came up with all this, but it's number 11. So if you have a, if you go out to and buy an external device, piece of hardware, and you want your modulation to control it, or you want to use the hardware to control the modulation, you make sure that it's mapped to CC number 1, and you want to make sure the expression is mapped to CC11. Okay, so now let's actually look at this inside of our DAW. So I think this will make it a little easier to understand. So I've got MIDI control, see, MIDI control open, and here are all the preset values that are already assigned within MIDI terminology. So like I said, modulation, CC number 1. Scroll down, expression, CC11. This is what I mean. So if you go out and buy a MIDI keyboard, that keyboard's mod wheel, if it has a mod wheel, and most of them do, will be assigned number 1, because that's the modulation that it's set to control. You can then, if you have another fader on your keyboard or external device, you then map that to control CC11. And that's how you could use a hardware device to control these instead of your mouse. That being said, I find that no matter what, I actually need to go back in and use my mouse to fine tune the performance. So I don't think you could ever get away from using your mouse, but definitely a separate physical hardware device, I think adds a lot of value. It certainly makes it a little more human when you control it. And by the way, before we close down here, you can just see there's other things you can control: breath, portamento, balance, MIDI volume, pan. So this is where you use the parameters, the MIDI parameters, to control things throughout a performance, throughout a MIDI performance. Okay, well, I hope that was helpful. These parameters in particular, modulation and expression, I use all the time. They're super powerful. So you really got to understand of anything that's in that we talk about, this is one of the most key things to get, because this will be what starts to make your performances sound more natural, more like a real player is playing them. Because again, the main thing to take away, especially with the concept of modulation, is that no player is going to hold a note at the same exact velocity and expression and dynamics throughout the entire performance. And it's just, that is what creates a robotic, unnatural sound. That's just not human. So these parameters, these tools that have been created for us, the whole point of it is to make it sound more human, more real. And we do that, like we did today, by kind of reenacting a performance. You want to kind of reenact how a person would play their instrument. All right, well, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments below. If you can like and subscribe, I would so appreciate it. It really helps out the channel and helps expose this video to others that might be interested in learning more about orchestral sample libraries. So I'll be back soon with part 6, so you don't want to miss it. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.